January 17, 1941. Pas de Calais, France. The morning air hangs cold and still over the captured French airfield. Frost clings to the wings of Messerschmitt Bf 109s lined in perfect formation, their yellow noses pointed toward England like accusing fingers. Inside a converted chateau that now serves as Jagdgeschwader 26's command post, Oberst Adolf Galland stands before a map of the Channel, a cigar clenched between his teeth, tracing invisible flight paths with fingers that have already shot down 43 enemy aircraft. He is 30 years old and carries himself with the confidence of a man who has looked death in the eye and found it wanting. But this morning, studying reconnaissance photographs of a twin-boomed American fighter still in its testing phases across the Atlantic, he feels something he has rarely permitted himself to acknowledge. Concerned that the photographs show the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a radical design with 2 engines, 2 booms, and a central nacelle housing the pilot and an unprecedented concentration of firepower. The intelligence reports speak of range estimates that trouble him. Galland taps ash from his cigar onto the stone floor and considers the implications. If the Americans enter this war, if they bring aircraft capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, the mathematics of aerial warfare will fundamentally change. The Luftwaffe has built its doctrine on the assumption of sanctuary that the Reich itself remains beyond the reach of sustained daylight bombing because no enemy fighter can fly that far and return home. But the twin-boomed shadow in these photographs suggests otherwise. He will bring this to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's attention. He must. It is his duty as a fighter commander to see clearly what others might wish to ignore, what Galland cannot know. Standing in that frost-covered morning in occupied France, is that his warning will be dismissed with such vehemence, such absolute certainty of German invincibility, that it will become emblematic of a larger blindness, a refusal to acknowledge American industrial and technological capability that will cost the Luftwaffe not merely battles, but the war itself. The story of the P-38 Lightning and Göring's insistence that it could never threaten Germany is not simply a tale of one aircraft or one commander's hubris. It is a window into the ideological rigidity that prevented Nazi leadership from adapting to a new kind of warfare, one where American abundance and innovation would prove as decisive as any army in the field. The Germany of 1941 still rides high on the intoxication of victory. In barely 2 years of war, the Wehrmacht has conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. The Luftwaffe has swept aside every air force it has encountered. Hermann Göring, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, has become the most decorated and powerful figure in the Reich after the Führer himself. He wears his titles like medals: Reichsmarschall, President of the Reichstag, Plenipotentiary of the Four-Year Plan, Master of the Hunt. His uniforms grow more elaborate with each passing month, his collection of estates more vast, his confidence more unshakable. Göring's Luftwaffe doctrine has been forged in the crucible of Blitzkrieg. The lessons seem clear. Air power exists to support ground operations, to destroy enemy air forces on the ground, to terrorize cities into submission. Strategic bombing in the Anglo-American sense, sustained campaigns against industrial infrastructure, seems wasteful, impractical. The Luftwaffe's bombers are medium-range tactical aircraft, Heinkel He-111s, Dornier Do-17s, Junkers Ru-88s. They are excellent at what they do. But what they do is operate within the protective umbrella of German fighters and relatively close to German-controlled territory. The concept of truly long-range escort fighters barely exists in Luftwaffe thinking. Why would it? German fighters like the Bf 109 and the newer Focke-Wulf FW 190 are designed for high performance, for climbing quickly, fighting aggressively and returning to nearby bases. Their range is measured in hundreds of kilometers, not thousands. This seems sufficient because every war Germany has fought has been a continental war, a war of movement and encirclement, where the front lines shift but remain within. Adolf Galland understands this doctrine intimately, helped refine it through his service in the Condor Legion during the Spanish Civil War and through the campaigns in Poland and France. But Galland possesses something increasingly rare among senior Luftwaffe commanders: intellectual flexibility. He can extrapolate from current conditions to future possibilities. He reads reports from Luftwaffe intelligence about American aircraft development not with dismissiveness but with professional interest. And what he reads about the P-38 troubles him deeply. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning represents a fundamentally different philosophy of fighter design, where German and British fighters prioritize dogfighting performance, tight turns, rapid climbs. Superior maneuverability. The P-38 embraces American strengths: powerful engines, heavy armament, long range, and high speed in straight flight. Its twin Allison V1710 engines give it redundancy. If one engine is damaged, the aircraft can return home on the other. Its tricycle landing gear makes it easier to operate from rough fields. Its concentrated nose armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns, and 120 mm cannon firing directly ahead rather than through a propeller arc, makes it devastatingly accurate. But most significant to Galland's analysis, its internal fuel capacity and potential for external drop tanks suggest operational ranges that could, theoretically, reach from England to Berlin. In February 1941, Galland requests an audience with Göring to discuss future threats to the Reich's air defense. The meeting takes place at Carenhall, Göring's vast hunting estate north of Berlin, a monument to excess built with looted art and marble torn from conquered nations. Göring receives his ace pilot in a study lined with old masters, wearing a silk dressing gown embroidered with his personal coat of arms. He is in good spirits. Why should he not be? His Luftwaffe has just concluded the campaign in the Balkans with characteristic efficiency. The British have been driven from Greece and Crete. The Afrika Korps under Rommel pushes toward Egypt. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, looms just months away, and Göring has assured Hitler that Soviet air power will be crushed in the opening days. Galland begins diplomatically, discussing current operations, acknowledging the Luftwaffe's successes. Then he transitions to his concern: American entry into the war, which most observers now see as inevitable despite nominal neutrality. He mentions the P-38, shows reconnaissance photographs, cites intelligence estimates of its range. He explains that if the Americans can base such aircraft in Britain, if they can escort heavy bombers deep into Germany, the strategic calculation changes entirely. The Reich's industrial cities, its aircraft factories, its synthetic fuel plants all become vulnerable in ways they have never been before. Göring listens with decreasing patience. When Galland finishes, the Reichsmarshal's response is not argument but assertion, not analysis but denial. The exact words vary in different accounts, but the substance remains consistent across multiple sources, including Galland's own post-war memoir. Göring dismisses the threat entirely. American fighters will never reach Germany, he declares. The distance is too great, the logistics too complex. The Americans have no stomach for the kind of losses that daylight precision bombing will entail. Their fighters are inferior to German engineering. Even if they could build aircraft with such range, which Göring doubts, they could never produce them in sufficient numbers to matter. Galland presses his case. He points out that underestimating American industrial capacity is dangerous. He notes that in the last war, American entry had proven decisive. He suggests that preparations should begin now for a coordinated air defense of the Reich in depth. Göring cuts him off. The discussion is over. Galland is dismissed with a wave of the bejeweled hand, sent back to his operational command with his concerns unaddressed and his warnings unheeded. This moment, this absolute refusal to contemplate unpleasant possibilities, will echo through the next 4 years of war. It represents more than one man's stubbornness. It reveals the fundamental weakness of Nazi decision-making, the inability to acknowledge information that contradicts ideological certainty. In Göring's worldview, shaped by racial theories and cultivated contempt for democracies, Americans are soft, decadent, materialistic. They may have industrial capacity, but they lack martial spirit. They may have resources, but they lack the will to use them effectively. The idea that American engineering could equal or exceed German quality is nearly incomprehensible to him. Germany has the world's finest scientists, engineers, and pilots. This is not merely opinion but article of faith. What Göring cannot or will not grasp is that American strength lies precisely in qualities that Nazi ideology teaches him to dismiss. Democratic capitalism, with its messy competition and decentralized innovation, has created an industrial ecosystem capable of remarkable adaptation. American abundance, the product of vast natural resources, transcontinental infrastructure, and free labor means that the United States can make mistakes, can produce multiple competing designs, can afford waste in ways that Germany cannot. And American pragmatism, unburdened by theories of racial destiny, focuses simply on what works rather than what should work according to doctrine. The P-38, Lightning itself, embodies these American advantages. Its development began in 1937 when the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a specification for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 360 miles per hour and 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. Lockheed's design team, led by Hall Hibbard and Kelly Johnson, produced a radical twin-boom configuration that maximized performance while solving practical problems. The twin engines provided redundancy and power. The tricycle landing gear improved ground handling. The concentrated nose armament eliminated the complexity of synchronizing guns with propellers. The design prioritized what American pilots would need: range, firepower, survivability. When the prototype XP-38 flew in January 1939, it immediately showed exceptional performance, reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour. But American development philosophy differed fundamentally from German practice. Where Luftwaffe aircraft went into production quickly and relied on frontline experience to drive modifications, American designers tested exhaustively, refined continuously, and accepted delays to get the design right. The P-38 would go through numerous variants, each improving on the last. Early models had problems with compressibility at high speeds, with cockpit heating, with engine reliability. Each problem was methodically addressed. By 1942, when P-38s began arriving in Europe, they represented not merely the original design but years of iterative improvement. Galland, returning to his command after the meeting with Göring, cannot force higher leadership to acknowledge what he sees clearly, but he can prepare his own pilots. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, as Germany becomes mired in the Eastern Front, and as the first American troops begin arriving in Britain, Galland emphasizes adaptability in fighter tactics. He studies reports of P-38 performance from pilots who encounter early models in North Africa. He notes their speed, their range, their hitting power. He understands that the comfortable days of 1940, when Luftwaffe fighters operated against outmatched opponents, are ending. The Americans enter the war in December 1941. and by early 1942, U.S. Army Air Force units begin deploying to Britain. The 8th Air Force, commanded by General Ira Eaker, starts building the infrastructure for strategic bombing airfields, maintenance facilities, bomb dumps, fuel supplies. The British, who have already learned through bitter experience that unescorted daylight bombing produces catastrophic losses, urge the Americans to adopt night bombing tactics. But the Americans insist on daylight precision bombing on the theory that destroying specific targets, ball bearing factories, aircraft plants, oil refineries will cripple German war production more efficiently than area bombing of cities. This strategy depends entirely on one factor: escort fighters. Bombers without escorts, even heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, cannot survive against determined fighter attacks. The early American daylight raids in 1942 and 1943, flown beyond the range of available escort fighters, prove this bloodily. German fighters tear into bomber formations, exploiting the brief window between when the escorts must turn back and when the bombers reach their targets. Luftwaffe pilots develop specialized tactics, head-on attacks to kill pilots and knock out engines, coordinated strikes that overwhelm defensive fire. Loss rates climb toward 20% on some missions, mathematically unsustainable levels that would destroy the 8th Air Force if continued. But the Americans persist with a stubbornness that Galland, watching from the other side, recognizes as dangerously effective. They accept losses that would cause other air forces to abandon the strategy. They study each mission, refine tactics, improve equipment, and they continue developing longer-range escorts. The P-38 Lightning begins arriving in significant numbers. In Britain in 1943, assigned to the 8th Air Force's fighter groups. Gradually, it extends the umbrella of protection deeper into occupied Europe. Galland sees the P-38s during combat in the spring of 1943, when the Americans launch raids against targets in France and the Low Countries. The twin-boomed silhouette is unmistakable, and its performance immediately impresses him. The P-38 is fast in level flight, faster than the Bf-109G in many conditions. It has excellent acceleration in a dive. Its concentrated nose armament proves devastating. Pilots hit by that combination of .50 caliber rounds and 20 millimeters cannon shells describe the effect as being struck by a sledgehammer. Most critically, it has the range. P-38s can escort bombers to targets that would previously have been undefended, and they can engage in combat and still return to Britain. The Lightning is not invincible. It has weaknesses that experienced Luftwaffe pilots learn to exploit. In tight turning fights, particularly at lower altitudes, the Bf-109 and FW-190 can outmaneuver it. Its large size makes it easier to spot and hit. The complexity of managing two engines increases pilot workload, but these tactical limitations matter less than the strategic reality. American escort fighters are now reaching deeper into German-controlled airspace with each passing month. In July 1943, Galland again seeks an audience with Göring, this time to report on the worsening situation in the West. The meeting takes place during the aftermath of the Battle of Hamburg, where RAF and USAAF combined bombing has killed over 40,000 civilians and destroyed much of the city. Göring is no longer the confident victor of 1941. The reversals in Russia, the loss of North Africa, the mounting pressure on all fronts have made him defensive and volatile. He alternates between rage at his subordinates and assurances to Hitler that the Luftwaffe will prevail. Galland presents evidence that should be undeniable. He shows loss reports. German fighter losses are climbing while pilot quality declines. Experienced pilots are being killed faster than replacements can be trained. The Americans are achieving air superiority over occupied Europe. And yes, their escort fighters, including the P-38 Lightning that Göring insisted could never reach Germany, are now routinely flying missions over the Ruhr, over the Rhineland, ever closer to Berlin itself. Göring's response mixes fury and denial. He questions the accuracy of the reports. He demands to know why the Luftwaffe is not destroying these American aircraft in the numbers he expects. He suggests that his pilots are not fighting aggressively enough, not pressing home attacks. When Galland tries to explain the material realities, that the Americans have numerical superiority and are gaining more each month, that German production cannot match American output, that losses are unsustainable, Göring accuses him of defeatism. There is a particular exchange during this meeting, reconstructed from multiple accounts, that captures the chasm between reality and ideology. Galland mentions that American pilots are becoming increasingly competent, that they are learning from experience and developing effective tactics. Göring responds with dismissive contempt. Americans are not natural warriors, he insists. They are tradesmen playing at soldiers. They fly their aircraft the way factory workers operate machines competently, perhaps, but without the warrior spirit that defines German fighter pilots. Galland, who has fought these American pilots and watched them improve, who has seen his own experienced men shot down by aircraft they supposedly outclass, understands that this response is worse than wrong. It is delusional. But he also understands that Göring cannot be persuaded by evidence that contradicts his fundamental worldview. The Reichsmarschall has built his identity on the superiority of German arms and the inevitable triumph of will over material factors. To acknowledge that the Americans might simply outproduce and overwhelm German defenses would be to admit that Nazi ideology has misread the nature of modern industrial warfare. The conversation that never quite happened, but should have, the one where German leadership confronts American capability honestly and adjusts strategy accordingly, would have required precisely the intellectual humility that totalitarian systems systematically eliminate. By 1943, there is no mechanism within the Nazi hierarchy for acknowledging fundamental errors. Göring cannot tell Hitler that his assurances were wrong. Hitler cannot tolerate being told that racial theories provide poor foundations for strategic planning. The entire system has become trapped in its own mythology. Meanwhile, across the Channel, American abundance manifests in ways that stagger German planners when they finally grasp the scale. The United States produces over 18,000 P-38 Lightnings during the war. More aircraft of this single type than Germany produces fighters of all types in some years. This production occurs while America simultaneously manufactures tens of thousands of other fighters, bombers, transports, and trainers. It happens while building the world's largest navy, while supplying allies with millions of tons of equipment, while maintaining civilian industrial production at levels that keep the home front comfortable. The P-38 becomes emblematic of this abundance. Each Lightning contains roughly 1,300 pounds of aluminum, more than most entire German fighters weigh empty. This extravagance makes German engineers shake their heads. Where a Bf-109 is a taut expression of minimalist design, every pound justified, the P-38 seems to waste metal on redundancy and pilot comfort. It has two engines when one might suffice, armor protection that adds weight, fuel tanks that seem profligate. But this apparent wastefulness reflects a different calculation. American strategists can afford to prioritize pilot survival and mission effectiveness over weight savings because they have enough aluminum, enough engines, enough of everything. German pilots who encounter P-38s in combat file reports that gradually shift from dismissiveness to respect to something approaching awe at the material superiority they represent. A Luftwaffe lieutenant named Heinz Nock, flying Bf-109s in defense of the Reich, Records in his diary an engagement with P-38s in October 1943. He describes how the American formation maintains discipline, how they use their speed advantage to control engagement geometry, how they break off attacks when at a disadvantage and simply extend away faster than the German fighters can pursue. Noak, a capable pilot with multiple victories, finds himself unable to close to effective firing range. The Americans dictate the terms of combat through superior performance, and when the engagement ends, both sides break off without losses, but the bombers the P-38s are escorting continue to their target unharmed. In Noak's calculation, this is a German defeat even without aircraft shot down. Because the mission fails. By early 1944, the strategic situation has become undeniable even to Göring. American fighters now escort heavy bombers to Berlin itself. The P-38 Lightning, along with the newer P-47 Thunderbolt and the exceptional P-51 Mustang, forms a layered defense that covers the entire route from English bases to targets deep in Germany and back. The Luftwaffe bleeds experienced pilots at rates that cannot be sustained. German factories work desperately to produce fighters in quantity, but they cannot match American output, and even when they produce aircraft, they lack the fuel to adequately train replacement pilots. There is a meeting in March 1944, documented by multiple participants, where Göring finally confronts Galland with a question that has been unspoken for 3 years. The Reichsmarschall asks his most successful fighter commander what the Luftwaffe needs to turn the tide in the air war. Galland, knowing the answer is impossible, responds with bitter precision: a squadron of Spitfires for the Channel front. The implication is clear: even British fighters would be preferable to the situation they face, because at least Spitfires would be reliably available with adequate fuel and ammunition. Göring, enraged by what he perceives as defeatism, asks what Galland really wants, what would actually make a difference. Galland, pushed beyond diplomatic caution, responds with the truth. He needs what the Americans have: numerical superiority, technological parity, adequate fuel, properly trained replacements, and sufficient time to rest experienced pilots between missions. He needs, in short, resources that Germany no longer possesses and cannot conjure through will or doctrine. The Reichsmarschall, faced with this catalogue of impossibilities, can only rage at his subordinates' supposed pessimism. The meeting ends with Galland effectively sidelined, eventually removed from command despite being the Luftwaffe's leading ace. The man who warned about the P-38 threat in 1941, who predicted exactly the strategic situation that has come to pass, is punished not for being wrong but for being right in ways that leadership cannot acknowledge. The P-38 Lightning never becomes the dominant American fighter in Europe. That distinction belongs to the P-51 Mustang, with its even longer range and superior dogfighting performance. But the Lightning serves with distinction through the end of the war, particularly in the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters where its range and twin-engine reliability prove especially valuable. It shoots down more Japanese aircraft than any other American fighter. It serves as a fighter bomber, a reconnaissance platform, a night fighter. Its versatility, a product of that supposedly wasteful American over-engineering, allows it to succeed in roles that specialized German designs cannot easily adapt to. The story of the P-38 and Göring's refusal to believe it could threaten Germany becomes part of Luftwaffe folklore, retold by surviving pilots as an example of how leadership failed them. But the deeper significance extends beyond one aircraft or one commander's blindness. It illustrates how ideological rigidity cripples adaptation. The Nazi system, built on assertions of superiority, could not adjust to evidence of equality or inferiority. It could not learn, could not pivot, could only insist more loudly that reality must conform to theory. American democracy, for all its inefficiencies and contradictions, possessed a crucial advantage. It could acknowledge problems without threatening its foundational legitimacy. When daylight bombing missions were failing, American commanders could admit failure and develop new tactics. When escort fighters proved inadequate, they could demand better ones and mobilize industry to produce them. When pilots reported deficiencies, engineers could redesign components without being accused of defeatism. The system was flexible because it was not dependent on any single person's infallibility. Abundance that the P-38 represented was not merely material, though the material superiority was certainly real and decisive. It was an abundance of ideas, of competing approaches, of willingness to experiment and fail and try again. German engineering produced remarkable aircraft throughout the war, some technologically superior to anything the Allies fielded. But German strategic rigidity meant these technical achievements never translated into operational success, because the system could not adapt fast enough to changing conditions. Galland survives the war, flying with JV-44, an elite unit equipped with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter in the war's final months. He shoots down additional aircraft, bringing his total to 104 victories. After the war, he writes his memoirs, consults for various air forces, and lives until 1996. In interviews late in his life, he often returns to that February 1941 meeting with Göring, to the moment when he tried to warn about the P-38 and was dismissed. He describes it not with bitterness but with a kind of weary recognition that the outcome was probably inevitable. Even if Göring had listened, Galland reflects in a 1992 interview, I don't know that it would have changed anything. The industrial disparity was too great, the strategic situation too poor. But we might have prepared better, might have fought smarter, might have saved some lives. The P-38 Lightning flies on in memory and in the scattered examples preserved in museums. Its distinctive silhouette, those twin booms, that central nacelle, that purposeful asymmetry remains instantly recognizable. To aviation enthusiasts, it represents a particular approach to fighter design, an elegant solution to complex problems. To historians of strategic bombing, it represents the technological development that made daylight precision bombing viable, that cost Germany its sanctuary, that brought war home to the industrial cities that fed the Wehrmacht. But perhaps most significantly, the P-38 represents what happens when material reality confronts ideological certainty. Göring insisted it could never reach Germany because accepting that it could would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about American capability, about German vulnerability, about the limits of will and doctrine in the face of overwhelming industrial superiority. His refusal to see what Galland tried to show him was not stupidity but something more profound, the inability of totalitarian systems to process information that contradicts their foundational myths. Every twin-boom shadow that crossed into German airspace after 1943 was proof that Galland had been right and Göring wrong. Every bomber formation that reached its target with P-38 escorts demonstrated that American engineering could equal German quality while vastly exceeding German quantity. Every successful mission proved that democratic capitalism, properly mobilized, could outproduce and outfight the supposedly superior fascist system. The abundance that America brought to the war, the endless streams of trucks and tanks and aircraft and ammunition, the capacity to wage global war on multiple fronts while improving civilian living standards, must have seemed incomprehensible to German commanders. Raised on theories of heroic struggle and blood and iron, could a nation of shopkeepers and factory workers, undisciplined and soft, generate such overwhelming force? The answer, which Göring never grasped, was that the shopkeepers and factory workers were not weaknesses but strengths. They understood production, logistics, systematic problem-solving. They could organize complexity at scale. They could innovate without requiring permission from racial theorists. In the end, the P-38 Lightning did exactly what Galland warned it would do. It reached Germany. It escorted bombers to Berlin and back. It helped establish air superiority over the Reich. It contributed to the destruction of the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force. And it did all this not through any single quality, but through the systematic application of American industrial and technological advantage, the abundance of resources, the flexibility of thought, the willingness to solve problems pragmatically rather than ideologically. The cigar smoke has long since dissipated from that French chateau where Galland first studied reconnaissance. Photographs of a twin-boomed fighter still in testing. The airfields are quiet now, their runways broken and overgrown. Carenhall, Göring's monument to excess, was demolished by his own orders as Soviet forces approached, and its site is now marked only by ruins and memory. The men who flew and fought are mostly gone. Their voices silent except in archives and fading recordings. But the lesson remains, carved in the contrails of 1,000 missions, written in the combat reports of pilots who faced what their leaders insisted was impossible. When ideology refuses to acknowledge reality, when certainty replaces analysis, when leaders punish messengers rather than hear unwelcome truths, the price is paid not in abstractions but in blood and cities and lost futures. Galland tried to warn. Göring refused to listen, and the twin-boomed fighters came anyway, riding the high cold air over Germany. Symbols not merely of one aircraft's capability but of a larger truth, that abundance, flexibility, and pragmatic democracy would prove, in the end, more powerful than any thousand-year ideology, built on myths of superiority and inevitable triumph. The P-38 Lightning reached Germany because freedom builds better than tyranny, because open societies innovate faster than closed ones, because abundance properly mobilized defeats scarcity however heroically defended. Galland knew this in 1941. Göring never understood it, even in 1945 when his world lay in ruins around him. And that difference between seeing clearly and seeing only what ideology permits determined not just the fate of the Luftwaffe, but the outcome of the war itself.